Hi, everybody. I'm Randee Dawn, and welcome to Live from the Kaleidocast Interviews with the Creatives. The Kaleidocast.nyc is the Brooklyn speculative fiction podcast. Our mission is to produce sci-fi and fantasy stories from talented new and established authors paired with stories from the best writers working today and pay them well for their art and vision. Here on Kaleidocast Live, we'll be talking with members of that community of creatives who we've had the honor of producing over the last 3 seasons. Subscribers at our Patreon or Patreon, I never know which way is the right way to say it, at the $6 level and up, get to interact with our guests, ask questions, and get access to a ton more amazing content. Subscribe to our Patreon or Patreon to join the fun. Those of you in the audience can direct your attention to the Ask a Question button. Please click on it and submit your questions there, and I, your intrepid host, will ask them later in the interview. Now, you may notice that I, Randee Dawn, your intrepid host, I'm not alone here. Directly next to me, depending on how you're looking at it, is Barbara Krasnoff. She is a Brooklyn-based writer whose stories have appeared in a variety of print and online publications. Her story, Sabbath Wine, was published in the anthology Clockwork Phoenix 5 and was a Nebula Award finalist. Not only that, it was turned into a podcast for Kaleidocast, and Kim Rogers did the audio. Her most recent sale, Time and Art, will appear in a future issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Maybe she can even tell us if she knows what that is, which future issue that is. She also has a mosaic novel, The History of Soul 2065, which I have many questions about. That was published by Mythic Delirium Books in June 2019. A full list of publications can be found at her website, brooklynwriter.com. That's all one word, brooklynwriter.com. When not writing science fiction or fantasy, she is the reviews editor for The Verge. Barbara, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for asking me.
My pleasure. You and I have known each other for a while, so it's kind of a different setup to be quizzing you about all these things. And
I feel like I'm not sure who should be interviewing who at this point.
Well, it's like I don't know how often we've had a chance to just sit down and I get to fire all sorts of nosy questions at you. This is great. I'm very excited about this. So anyway, thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing fine. I'm here in my Brooklyn office. I've been working remotely ever since March of 2020, and working at The Verge and working on my fiction and going back and forth, and everything's cool.
Cool. Well, I want to jump right in and talk a lot about your collection, The History of Soul 2065. That was published by Mythic Delirium, and it's full of stories that they sort of do, but they also don't connect, hence the idea of the mosaic novel. Tell us a little bit about what that means for anyone who hasn't read the collection.
Yeah, I'm not sure who came up with that idea. I was introduced to it by Rick Bowes, who was a writer who I urge people to look for his novels. And he was a master at the mosaic novel, which is basically, with a mosaic, you have a lot of pieces that put together make a whole. And that's what a mosaic novel is. It's as if you have one story about one character and there's another character in the background, and then in another story you find out who that character in the background was and what they were, and you find out more about their relationship than you really suspected. And the idea is that by the end of the novel, you should actually feel that you've met a lot of people, that you know a lot more about them than you did at the beginning, and that together the story sort of comes together and you understand them and the point of the novel without really having a single storyline throughout the whole thing.
Right. Okay. Now you wrote those stories, from what I can tell. I'm getting some of my dates off of Wikipedia, so do feel free to fix me on this.
Oh.
From what I can tell, you wrote those stories over the course of basically a decade. Like the first one came in the beginning of the 2000s, and the last one came towards the end of the 2009, 2010. Why did you sort of keep returning to this world of, for lack of a better word, the world of 2065? Like, why did you keep coming back to that with your stories?
Well, that's the interesting thing. And I actually, the last stories I wrote were written, actually, one or two were written for the book. So it's more like 2 decades.
Okay.
I didn't consciously. Coming back to it, that's the weird thing. What happened was I was writing fictional stories about people. And of course, as with every writer, a little bit of people you know, or people you've met, or people you who are a little bit like your relatives, but not quite, find their ways into these stories. And I was sitting with a friend talking about how I was a short story writer and I really should have a novel out, but I can't because I can't keep my attention on one thing long enough to write a full novel. And she basically pointed out to me that a lot of the characters in my stories appeared in my other stories. Now, not exactly at that point, but they were basically the same people. And so I gathered together a lot of my stories, and damn if she wasn't right.
Very observant, actually.
Yeah, that for example, a character based on my father who sort of appears as a young soldier in one story, appears as a dying salesman in another story, and appears in, well, I don't want to give it away, but then appears in yet a third story. And so I took a bunch of these stories and I made myself a family tree, and I started fitting them into that. It took me like 6 months because it was impossible.
Right.
And I started tweaking them, changing some names, changing some of the things that happened to them, even switching a few of the years. And I put them together, and eventually they found their way to Mike Allen, who is the publisher of Mythic Delirium. And he sort of said, well, this one is wrong. So I pulled it out. He said we could really use a couple more. And so I wrote a couple more. And eventually it became a whole.
Interesting. It's almost like, it was almost like this book was a collaboration by multiple authors, because obviously you wrote everything, but you had this one friend who read your things and observed the commonalities. And then you had Mike, who sort of put these final finishing touches on it in terms of what worked and what didn't work and all of that. Like this book has many authors in some ways, even though you obviously are the one who gets your name on the book. So if I'm correct, Stoop Ladies is the first one, correct? In terms of when you wrote it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I have to check, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, we'll take Wikipedia's word for this. But can you tell us a little bit about what that's about? Because to me, that's interesting. That's the first one that you ended up constructing.
Yes. Well, Stoop Ladies is actually one of the most based on reality, except of course for the fantasy element. I was living in South Slope at the time. I was living on 14th Street, right off the park in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And it was still at that point when I moved in, a very blue collar area. It was starting to change. There were more richer, more well-off upper middle class people moving in. But at the time, a lot of the homes were owned by people who had moved in as young couples back in the 40s and 50s, and who were now, hitting their age. And they were used to like sitting on the stoops at night and talking and gossiping and complaining and watching the cars go by and kill their axles on the various bad streets. And I was renting the upper floor of an apartment, and I would come home from work, and there would be these ladies sitting around and gossiping in their house coats, and sometimes with wine, and with their one had this little obnoxious poodle that was always yapping at everyone who walked by, and they'd have their old-fashioned folding chairs, the metal ones with the plastic. And so I said, there has to be more to these ladies than this. And I imagine what would happen if there really was more. And if these were actually women who were sort of had a magic that they were just sort of using when they wanted to and hiding from everybody else. And that's where that story came from.
Okay. The things that you're saying as you're describing it, I totally remember the story, but what strikes me is how detailed that memory is for you. And it strikes me that in order to, anybody can tell these kind of stories or can tell stories about, people who live in New York, but what really makes the best ones sing is when you have the strength of detail. And do you sort of feel as a writer that you're kind of a magpie, that you're just taking little details from everywhere and storing them away for the future?
Oh, absolutely. And, there's so much that I sometimes collect or start. I have so many stories about things that I've observed or thought about that are just sort of sitting in my computer or sitting in my filing cabinet and that will never actually see the light of day.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you collect things and sometimes they come together. And I try to keep notes. You're sitting in the subway and you see somebody doing something interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And you write it down and maybe it'll come up again and maybe it won't.
Right. One question I was wondering about is why, for the title of the book, why the year 2065? What is the significance of that year?
Okay. This is embarrassing.
We don't have to answer it if it's that embarrassing.
That's quite all right. Originally, the book was called Lost Connections.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, story. There was a story called Lost Connections,
Mm-hmm.
and Mike thought it should act, but that story is near the beginning. It's not one of the really crucial stories in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought it should be named after the final story, which is which is the history of Soul 2065.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not the absolute final. I did write one to sort of round it out, but it's basically the pivotal story in the book. And 2065 is the address of the building in Canarsie where I grew up.
Nice.
65 Rockaway Parkway. And so so in the story, the characters are sitting around the Passover table and this is the first Passover in the story, which takes place over the course of many Passover Seders, and are sort of discussing whether about whether they're all one soul, whether they're parts of a little soul, and they start joking about how there should be a union, and unions have numbers. So one person says, okay, we're part of Soul Union 2065. I just pulled it out of my head.
Right.
Everyone looking at the book assumes it's a year.
Uh-huh.
And actually it could be because the end of that story takes place in our future at approximately what would be the year 2065. So it works either way.
It's a nice way of just the way that the random consciousness can bring us things that actually have more meaning than if we had sat down and done a ton of research and said, well, what would be the strategically best number here or something like that, like this to me gives it more resonance than if you had said to me, well, I calculated all the numbers and this is what seemed to be the best or something like that.
Yeah. And if people choose to think it's the year, I'm happy.
Yes. So Sabbath Wine is one of the stories in the collection. Not only did it get nominated for a Nebula Award, it was featured as an audio recording on Kaleidocast, as we mentioned earlier in the introduction. Tell us a little about where that story came from.
Okay. It started with a memory that my mother told me. When she was a little girl, and my mother is 96 now, so you can do the math backwards. When she was a little girl, she used to, and she also lived in Brooklyn, and in East New York, in a very mixed immigrant neighborhood. And she used to sit on the fire escape in the, where they lived, and there was an alleyway, and then there were other houses. And she said she used to sometimes someone across the way would be singing blues. She said a woman would be singing blues or gospel, and she used to sit there and listen to her. And she thought it was the most marvelous thing, and for the rest of her life, she loved blues. And she said there was also a church nearby where they would sing gospel, and she'd walk by and listen. And that's where this started, where my main character, the little girl, is sitting and listening to a storefront church where they're practicing um, singing gospel in preparation for their Sunday services. So that's where it began. And originally, I mean, it went through a lot of iterations. And originally, it was more about prohibition, and then it was about the two children. But that wasn't working for me.
Right.
And at one point, it was about a rabbi who had a young boy who was helping him get wine. And the young boy turned into the young boy who was in the story. And then I said, well, let's bring in a little girl. And it went through a lot of iterations. The the father in the story is sort of kind of my grandfather, although he died when I was fairly young, so I didn't know him. But from stories, another and his friend who's sitting in the park came from a story that my mother's cousin told us how after work in their part of Brooklyn, a lot of on hot days, a lot of evenings, a lot of the people would gather in the park, but there'd be one bench for the socialists, one bench for the anarchists, one bench for the social anarchists. I mean, there were, one bench for those who read the Vorwärts, one who read the Freiheit, and they'd all be sitting on their separate benches, yelling at each other and arguing it with each other. And I said, I gotta put that in. So that's where that came in. So it came from a lot of little things. And finally, there was a book I came across, which was a photography book of the postcards that people used to make in the South from lynchings. I mean, it's the most horrific thing you've ever seen in your life. And I was looking through that, and that also, had a part in the book. So all sorts of different things.
Right. And I imagine you've listened to it since it was added to Kaleidocast. What's the experience of hearing it like for you? I mean, to hear your own words through somebody else's voice.
It's a little strange. She did a marvelous job, and I was very glad to hear her. But I have to say that it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's because you sort of hear it in your own words. And also, I've read it at the Nurseff readings and other places, and those were videoed. So I've heard myself read it, and it's and that's a weird sensation too. So I have a little trouble with it, but it has nothing to do with the reading itself, which is wonderful. It's just very hard to listen to my own words in a different way than how I hear them in my head.
Yeah. This is a bit of a side question, and I don't mean to make this about me, but I've just had a book that's been turned into an audiobook also. And it wasn't until I was in touch with the person who was doing the audiobook reading that I realized I don't necessarily hear my characters in my head. I mean, I can visualize them. I have a very strong visual sense of what's going on. So hearing somebody else putting a voice into a character that I had created was a little bit like, oh, that's how you're hearing it. Do you hear your characters when you're creating them, or like, what's your sensory experience when you're writing the book or writing the story?
Because I'm sort of the opposite. I do hear them. I don't see them. I mean, as much. I need to have a visual because you're writing it down. You have to present a visual.
Right.
That's the hardest part for me. And in fact, I recently finished a story where I realized part of the problems with it is that I hadn't given enough description. And I had to go through and really make sure that people could see what I was not visualizing, but see what I was imagining was happening. On the other hand, in the story, and I can give this out because it doesn't really say anything, one of the things that happens is that there is a sort of a ball where someone sings after the ball. And I hear that so clearly in my head every time I'm writing. And sometimes I'm singing it to myself. So I have a much, and I would not do that to you. So I have a much more audio sense of a story than a visual sense, which is a little bit strange.
I think this is one of these questions that I never thought to ask until just recently. A good friend of mine who's also a writer says that she is unable to visualize her stories at all, and how she manages to write such great stories without having a visual component. For me, like, that's just totally different. So it's just interesting to me to hear how people picture their stories before they end up becoming words on the page. Mm-hmm. And do you think that it's a different experience to hear a book with your ears rather than, say, reading it with your eyes? I know people talk about reading a book when they listen to it, and that's a different discussion, really. But what do you think?
It is, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. For example, when I'm driving, I listen to audiobooks.
Right.
And for example, I'm a great I'm a great fan of the Patrick O'Brian books, about the orb remastering,
right?
Which takes place in the Napoleonic Wars. And when I read, I tend to read very quickly, and which is why that books like that, or like Dickens, I have to read several times because I'm always missing stuff, and it's always like rereading it. But you can't do that when you're listening. When you're listening, you have to listen to every word unless your mind wanders, which occasionally it does when you're driving and you have to suddenly pay attention to something else. So it's a different experience. I get more. I remember many years ago when I was driving back and forth I was commuting to New Jersey for a job, and there was a science book about physics that I had been dying to understand. I could not. I read it 2 and 3 times. The first 3 chapters, I never got past that. I could not get it. But listening to it, I finally started to understand at least a little bit of it, because I was being forced to listen to every word and to really take in every word.
Right.
So that's, for me, that's the difference.
Right. So let's shift a little bit. You mentioned some of this earlier when we were talking about your stories, but I wanted to revisit this. Many of the stories in the book do relate to your family history, or at least in your mind include characters that were relations or people that you had heard about. Why is that such a rich mine of inspiration for you?
Well, I'm not sure, because I should say that half of it is from my family. The other half is from my partner Jim Freund's family. And we come from very different backgrounds, the same yet different. I mean, they're both Jewish backgrounds, but mine is from an Eastern European background, very political. Came in the early part of the 20th century. His is a German Jewish background. They were in Germany during World War II. They had to escape the Holocaust. There were all sorts of happening. So it's very different. But these are, to me, I grew up listening to stories in my family. When I met Jim, who I've been with for a very long time, I listened to the stories from his family, and they just became so much a part of me that, it's not all I write about, naturally.
Yeah.
I write science fiction stories. My very first published story was about a sign language interpreter, because that's what I was doing at the time. I was studying to be a sign language interpreter. So I guess when I write, it's much more involved with my life at that time than maybe with some other authors.
Okay. And you mentioned about the fact that you're Jewish. I'm Jewish also. How do you think that Judaism influences your choices of subject matter, or maybe even the style of writing that you have?
That's a very hard question, because I'm Jewish. I'm an American. I'm a New Yorker, and I'm not sure I can separate out any of those. I'm somebody who grew up in a certain time, so that's part of what I do. I'm someone who's really into tech, so that's part of it too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I'm not real. I grew up learning Yiddish. That's part of it too. Um, it's very hard. I'm afraid I'm going to sort of not answer the question because I'm not absolutely sure.
Sure. Yeah, it's one of those things I don't know. It's hard to pick out the influences, any influences, whatever they are, that go into the writing. But I think what's interesting, and I don't even know if I have a good question to phrase here, but it's more like I feel like Judaism and Jewishness in storytelling, in the movies, in TV, there's still in a lot of ways for mass audiences this exoticism to it. Like, oh, if they're going to be Jewish, the whole story has to be about the fact that they're Jewish, as opposed to just this is something that they happen to have a Sabbath, or they happen to have Passover, or they happen to have whatever. And it's refreshing to me to be reading stories not just that are genre related, but and have Jewish influences, but that it's part of the fabric as opposed to the focus of the story, or this uniquely, ooh, look at this weird exotic thing. So that's one of the reasons I have enjoyed your writing so much. And again, that's more of a comment than a question. But
no, I totally understand it. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Mike had to help me with is because I grew up in New York, where everybody, they're either Jewish or they know Jewish.
Yeah.
Like who is it? Oh God, Jim will never forgive me. There's a comedian who basically said that if you're in New York, you're Jewish. It doesn't matter who else you are.
Right.
Now I've lost where I'm going. The idea is that I made so many assumptions. That even the published stories, some of the published stories, basically when it was copy edited, I would have to sort of, I don't want to explain this,
right.
But at the same time, I have to let people understand what I'm saying when I say this phrase. So that was something I had to deal with, because for me, this is just part of my world.
Right.
And but it's not part of everyone's world. Most people can assume that when someone says Christmas, they understand what's going on. And certainly growing up in America, you pretty much know what's going on. But if someone says, okay, I broke my fast after Yom Kippur, somebody may not understand exactly what it is. So you have to really explain it, but not explain it, because then you've pulled out of the story.
Right, exactly. You don't want to underscore your own exoticism, but you want to make sure that the reader knows what you're talking about.
Yeah. I also was hoping, and I wanted to emphasize, a lot of people, Jewish means Hasidim or rabbis or religion. And I wanted to emphasize that it also means a culture and a society and a way of thinking. I mean, at least one of my characters has a huge fight with the local rabbi. And it isn't about religion. Well, it is about religion, but it's about either religion or the lack of it. And about politics. And, there's a lot of things that, that are not a caricature of what it is to be Jewish. It's just part of being a certain type of human.
Right. Exactly. And it's true. When you mentioned that about the whole New York thing, I mean, I'm not originally from New York, but living in New York, I sort of forget. It's easy to forget sometimes that there's a vast majority of this country that is not familiar with anything, maybe beyond, say, Hanukkah. If you say Hanukkah, oh yes, that's the Jewish Christmas. And after that, they're kind of lost after that.
Yeah, I know. I went to college in upstate New York, and because I grew up in an extremely mixed neighborhood, a working class, a lot of kids from different backgrounds. I went upstate, and at first I was protected from that because I went to a state university, so 3/4 of people there were from New York. Of the kids there were from New York. Anyways, then I took a job out in the town in Binghamton, and it was very, very weird because for the first time I was among people who were what we used to call WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, no, these aren't just people on the TV sets. This is how a lot of America is.
Right.
And for me it was a little bit foreign.
Yeah, that was exotic for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who would you say you're influenced by? I mean, other Jewish writers or other writers just in general? I mean, how do you think you've been influenced by the people who do influence you?
I've been influenced by a huge number of people, and it's very hard to say.
Mm-hmm.
To start with, when I was growing up, I was very into British 19th century, such as Dickens. I was a huge Dickens fan, huge Austen fan, Charlotte Bronte.
Mm-hmm.
Not so fond of Wuthering Heights, but we won't go into that.
That's a different conversation for sure.
But I was also reading as a child in the original, because I was learning the language, some of the Yiddish authors, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Sholem Aleichem, who wrote other things besides the Tevye stories. I mean, he had a huge amount of stuff. Then I started reading science fiction, and I started with Asimov, Clarke, and these days, I mean, the number of wonderful writers, it's very, very hard. Michael Chabon, I love your latest thing. Karen Hewler's Our Splendid City is fabulous. Mm-hmm. There's Wandering Stars, an anthology of Jewish fantasy and science fiction by Jack Dan, which was it's about 20 years old, 30 years old. Mm-hmm. The People of the Book, which is a more modern thing of Jewish writing. Mm-hmm. Octavia Butler.
Right. Oh, yeah.
I was just telling somebody, I used to walk around with a paperback of Kindred in my book, because one day I went into I think it was a donut shop, and I happened to have Kindred with me. And the young woman who, at the time I was in my 20s, I think late 20s, and this was a teenager, and she was going, "Oh, what is that?" Because she could see it. She said, "It's a Black author." I said, "Yeah, it's a wonderful book here." And I gave it to her, and she took it, and I said, "Okay, that's it." So for like several years, I walked around with an extra copy of Kindred in my bag in case I found something. You want this? So it's very hard to say. Huge, and sure. There are incredibly a lot of new young authors out there now. Mm-hmm. Who I'm incredibly impressed by and envious of, because they are so damn good. So
yeah. Well, so who really inspired you to be a writer in the first place? Was it like from reading something and, I want to do that? Or was it a family member? Or, what really got you into this writing sickness?
That I can't tell you, because I can't remember a time when I didn't want to be a writer.
Okay.
I mean, I can recite for you the Dr. Seuss books that were my first.
Right.
I've always been a reader, and I assumed I was going to be a writer. I actually had, now I have to try to remember the name of it. The Wind and the Rain, and Poems Published by Children of the English-Speaking World. When I was about 11, I had 3 poems published.
Oh, right. Nice.
So, and that was even before, this was natural to me. It was like, of course I'm going to be a writer. And when I was a teenager, I submitted my first poems. The other one was submitted, the ones when I was a kid was submitted by my principal, and we didn't even know about it till the book came out. But when I did my first honest submission when I was about 15 years old, and got accepted, I mean, wow. I haven't been that successful since. So it was just always there, and it was. I don't know if someone came to me and said, "No, Barbara, I'm afraid you've wasted your life. You're not really a writer." I would basically go, "Okay, thank you very much. I'll go jump off this nearest Empire State Building now."
Right.
Right. I'm. This is just what I am.
Sure. And absolutely. And again, relying again on Wikipedia, so please feel free to fix me on this, but it seems like obviously you had poems published because you just told us about those. But from what I can tell, your first published short story was in 1989. It was called Signs of Life.
That's it. Yeah, that was the one. That was the one, the interpreter one.
Oh, right. That's the interpreter one, of course. So you were, I don't want to give any ages away necessarily, but you were in your 30s at the time. And then there's kind of this gap, and your other fiction credits largely seem to come from since the turn of the century. How do you fit writing into your life? Like, I mean, there are people who like, oh, I've been writing since I was 20 and publishing since I was 20. And then there are people who like, I've been writing my whole life, but then didn't get anything published until you were in your 40s or whatever. I mean, how does the writing part of your life fit into the big pie that is?
Yeah, I'm actually checking because I don't recall there being that quite of a gap, and so I'm going down, looking on my thing here. Okay, so yeah, my first one was Signs of Life, and that was in '89. Yeah, and then there was Stoop Ladies, which was 2000, so there was a bit of a gap.
Right.
Just wondering. Well, for one thing, I actually wrote a book.
Right, not fiction book, right?
Nonfiction, but of course that was even before Signs of Life. That was about robots. And I was doing a lot of. That's when I started writing about tech. And for a while, that took up a lot of my time. I'm also an incredibly slow writer, which is why, comparatively to other people, I mean, I've had a number of stories published, but not nearly as many as you would think for somebody my age, because it takes me such a long time, and because I don't know, I just haven't been. Well, and at any rate, I just haven't had that many published.
That's fine. I mean, for me personally, I got into nonfiction writing because I'm like, oh, I'll get paid for writing, and I thought to myself, that'll help me with my fiction. And I don't regret magazine journalism. That's what I did, but I don't know if that necessarily helped me with my fiction. Do you feel like all of the nonfiction that you've done for a living has interfered with, or maybe helped your ability to write fiction?
I'm not sure. And I will tell you that, if I went to someone and said, hey, I'm not really, I haven't written that much, and they go, yeah, right. Because I have written a huge number. I mean, I'm talking in the hundreds of articles,
right,
about computers and other things. And on the one hand, yeah, it sort of gets in the way, because if you're writing all day, it's a little hard to get your mind into writing in the evening, or writing first thing in the morning and then switching gears. On the other hand, boy, it has taught me how to do a deadline. And also, I've been an editor as much as a writer in my professional life. And it's one thing that slows me down, but also I think that helps, because when I have a story, I read it over and over again. I edit myself.
Right.
So even when I put in a first draft to like a writer's group or something, it's usually in fairly good shape.
Right.
Because I'm such an anal editor for my own stuff as well as for other people.
Detail oriented, perhaps.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a negative thing.
Let's be polite about it.
So I have a bunch of other questions, and I'm just going to dive into those. But I know at some point we're going to take some questions. So just a quick note to anybody who's here in the audience and listening: if you have questions, just throw them in there, and we will get to those in a couple of minutes. And until then, we'll just keep barreling along. Again, since short stories at this point has really been your medium, is there something that you specifically like about it, or is it because you, like you said earlier, you just can't focus on a longer piece? Do you have a novel that you want to work on?
I do have a novel that I want to work. I have several that I've tried to work on.
Mm-hmm.
And the awful thing is that, for example, I went to a I spent a week with some other writers, and I was working on this novel, and I actually got a ways into it, and then sort of it fell by the wayside, and I got an email a year later by this very sweet woman who had gone with me and saying, "What happened? I want to find out what happened." And I'm going, "Oh, I didn't get to it yet." I'm trying very, very hard on a different one, which about Hart Island.
Oh, right. Yes, I remember you telling me.
And I'm having. I mean, I have it all mapped out in my head,
Mm-hmm.
and I've actually written a good many thousand words on it. So what I tried to do is write a long short story, novella, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
um, as sort of a push for myself. I think if I can at least finish that, then I can write around it and maybe actually come up with a real novel length work.
Right.
One day I should be able to finish.
And just really quick to tell our audience, in case they're not from the area, what is Hart Island?
Okay, Hart Island is an island off the coast of Queens, I think. And for many, many, many years, it was where people were buried who were not, who did not have the money for a burial. And they basically, for many years, it was done by prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so nobody else was allowed on the island. And so you have these vast number of graves out there with just numbers on them. And this is dating back years and years.
Right.
At one point, it was actually a Civil War grave, and then they were going to do other things with it, and then that didn't work out, and it went back to just being, I forget the term for a grave for people who are otherwise indigent.
Right.
Um,
A pauper's grave? Is it something more?
yeah, basically.
Okay.
And people were not allowed to come, even if they found out that their loved ones were there. And very often it was simply because they were sick and the other person was buried before they had a chance to claim the body or what have you. They were not allowed to come to even pay respects or to find anything because it was considered a security thing. Recently, it has gone to the Parks Department instead, and they were going to actually open it up to visitors just about the time the pandemic hit. But hopefully they are going to turn it into a place where not only can people come and visit their relatives and visit their ancestors, but also people can come and just treat it as a beautiful place to come. Right. But that's in the future.
Right. It is interesting to me, and I'm just thinking about this now, that particular subject is interesting you as a potential novel. And then we were talking earlier about pulling from your families and Jim's family's histories. Like, this is clearly a thread that interests you on a number of different angles.
Yeah. And I apologize because I wish I had this in front of me, because I heard about there is a woman who is an artist, and I'm sorry, I forget her name. And she did a video project on Hart Island way back. And she found out that a lot of the records were lost. People couldn't find out whether or not their children or their parents or their siblings or their lovers were buried there. A lot of people were buried there during the AIDS crisis. And so she created a website where people could actually look up records if they wanted to. And she worked very, very hard to get Hart Island pulled away from the penal department to the Parks Department,
right?
Which finally. And I was just fascinated. I mean, this is for years. I've just been fascinated by the idea that there's this island with all these people there for generations, and most of us weren't even aware it was there.
Yeah.
We've been allowed on it if we were. It's something about it.
Right, exactly. So before we start running out of time, I want to go into a little bit more of your personal life, if that's okay. Your long-term partner is Jim Freund, as you mentioned earlier. He's the host of WBAI's Hour of the Wolf. Has been doing it for, I think, 50 years now, which is an incredible.
Yeah,
that's an incredible number. And he, of course, he's very involved with luminaries in the speculative fiction world. I'm wondering, was that mutual interest in writing or writers or speculative fiction one of the things that brought you guys together originally?
Yes. We actually were brought together by computer. Back in the
thick.
Yeah, back in the BBS days, bulletin board systems. Before there was a web, there were BBSs where people would talk to each other and exchange chats. And there was one called Magpie. And what we would do is we'd have get-togethers where everybody, most of us in those days, the BBSs were local because you actually had to pay extra if you were going to call long distance. And this was all done over the phone lines. So most of us were local to New York City, and so sometimes we'd get together at a hang in order to see a movie or just get together and hang out. And that's basically how I met Jim in person. But we knew each other for quite a long time before then because we used to chat online.
Right, exactly. And I'm wondering, at what point in your process does Jim read your work? I mean, is it important to get his opinion before you bounce it around in the rest of the world, or does he not read it until much later on?
He doesn't read it too much later on.
Okay.
It's we do help each other with stuff. I mean, he has me occasionally listen to he does a lot of audio editing, and sometimes not only for his radio show, but also for Nightmare and other magazines. And so sometimes he says, "Here, come listen to this. Which sounds better?"
Right.
And I will sometimes say, "Okay, could you read this and tell me how does it look to you?" But for the most part, I just show him the finished product or what's near to the finished product.
Right.
He did help me a lot on the book, however. I did have him look at the book, and he helped me organize it, and that type of thing.
Okay. You and I have both obviously been members of the same writers group called Tabula Rasa. I'm not in it at the moment, but why do you think writers groups are important, or are they overrated?
Oh, I think they're incredibly important. At least it depends who you are. For me, they've been incredibly important because I cannot read my stuff the way somebody else would. It's in my head, and I make assumptions. And if I give it to somebody else and they say, for example, a recent story was, "How old is she?" Oh,
Right.
I never bothered to say, or sometime. I mean, I'm recently totally revamped the story because I gave it out, and 5 out of 5 people said the same thing about it, that they didn't understand this, and this part was fine, but they didn't understand this other thing. And I said, okay, obviously, what's in my head is not coming out on the page.
Right.
And that's what writers groups are good for. That's what good writers groups are good for. I have talked to people who are part of writers group, which either do nothing but praise, which doesn't help anybody, or do nothing but, or who feel that they have to be ultra critical, which doesn't help either.
Right.
And I'm going to get a little bit on my lecture here and say, when you're in a writers group, you have to first say what's good about the story or what works in the story. Then you can talk about what maybe doesn't work.
Right.
And you don't want to discourage people from writing. You just want to help them be better writers.
Right. Do you remember when you first were able to accept criticism for your work? I mean, it can be a hard thing, and not everybody's ready to hear it right away when they first start writing. But do you remember, like, when that became something?
Yeah, well, I remember the first Rio criticism of my work was so awful that I was able that nothing else since then has lived up to it, and it was in college. I mean, no, and I joined it was my writers 201 or whatever, and it was the first workshop. It was like in my sophomore year, and I wrote a story, and I gave it in. The idea is you give it in and you get a critique. And I gave in my first story, and it, of course, was a science fiction story. And it probably wasn't very good, but nothing that anyone really wrote at that point in that group was very good. And the teacher, before it became my turn, sits up and says, before we critique this, I do want to say that I stopped reading science fiction when I was 12, and I do not consider it a literature for adults. You're muted, by the way. Well, I'll continue until she unmutes. The point was that that was then declared open house for everybody, and I was basically attacked because they wanted to be on the good side of the teacher. And it was so bad that afterwards, one of the kids in the class came to me and apologized for what had happened. And in fact, the teacher apologized the next class because he realized what he'd done. After that, nothing was bad. I can see a little mute thing in front of your. If you put your cursor over your thing, you may see because it looks like it's software. Hi, people. This is the tech barber coming through from the barber. Where if anyone has any questions, I can actually see them. So while Randee is trying to figure out why we can't hear her, if anybody wants to ask me a question, please feel free. In fact, please do it because we're
Hey, happy to. This is Brad hanging out in the shadows.
Hi there.
My question was just how did the pandemic affect you and your writing? Did it change your writing routine? Did it throw you off? I know a lot of writers have reacted differently to the past couple of years. So I'm just curious.
Yes, that's a great question, and it totally threw me off. And I thought it wouldn't. I thought, okay. First of all, I was used to working remotely, so having moved from my job from the office to working out of my home office was not a big deal for me. But for some reason, just everything that was going on and the anxiety and being anxious about my mother who is living on her own. I was just I just was sort of not writing. I started again about a year ago, and slowly, but yeah, it was sort of not a good experience. I know, yeah, and I know other writers who said that they couldn't go to work. They sort of sublimated it all in their writing. So so that was my general thing. Randee, if you want, you could write.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left. If anybody else has a question, we can jump on that. And if not, I can, or hopefully Randee will be back in just a moment, or I can bring things to a close. Let's give Randee a moment to come back.
For a moment. Meanwhile, I will do the advertising thing. The book is The History of it's backwards. 2065. If you do nothing else, find a picture of it and look in the cover. The artist did a wonderful, wonderful thing. I sent her a bunch of my pictures from my family and Jim's family. And if you look, you can't see it on here, but if you look in the background of the tree, you'll see all these very old photos of my and Jim's parents and grandparents and grandparents, including a picture of my grandmother when she was 20, and a radical, and all sorts of things like that. So you can get the book on Amazon or any place else. Hey, there you are.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Yes.
The fancy microphone cut off on me in the middle of everything. I'm so sorry about that. But you vamped very well, and thank you, Brad, for stepping in on that. But please go ahead and finish your thing, and I'll wrap us all up after.
No, I was just saying you can get the book anywheres. I will be having a story coming out of fantasy and science fiction. I don't know when, but my blog brooklynwriter.com will announce it, as I will. I'll be all over Facebook and Twitter screaming, I got the story and it's coming, because I've always wanted to be in that venue. And please check out the book. I'd love to have people read it. And if you do, feel free to get in touch, Barb K and Twitter or whatever, and let me know what you think.
Now, I was away for a second, so if this already got answered, we do have one question for you, and then we'll do the wrap up. How has the pandemic affected your creativity?
We did that.
All right, good. So, Barbara, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for vamping with us, and technical difficulties, etc.
Fun.
Do you want to give a shout out to anybody?
Give a shout out to Jim Freund and to all my friends, and I apologize for not coming to readings and things. I will mend that.
Okay. So thank you again, Barbara. I wanted to remind everybody who's here in our audience, this is a production of kaleidocast.nyc. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and wherever else you get your podcast Jones on. We are a community-based project to publish fantastic authors from New York City. Please support our Patreon for season 4. For $6 a month, you are invited to more interviews like this one. Also, the Kaleidocast album and Channel Ping, as well as art from every season, and monthly episodes of the Kaleidocast Epic Exquisite Corpse stories as they are produced. Amazing mind-twisting tales written by our producers and select contributors. Season 2 and 3's Exquisite Corpses it began in Red Hook, audiobook recorded by C.S.E. Cooney, and Big Trouble in Deep Space were written by the likes of Carlos Hernandez, Mike Allen, as you mentioned him earlier, Barbara Krasnoff, who you may have heard of, Kat Valenti, Chris Dykman, S.A. Chakraborty, Fenderson D. Clark, Max Gladstone, and C.S.E. Cooney. So this wraps us up for another interview, and I'm going to beat my microphone over the head a few times. And thank you all for being with us. Please join us again for more interviews. Have a good night, everybody.